Every morning, before anything real has even happened, your mind is already moving, replaying, anticipating, holding on to things that haven't even touched reality yet. And without noticing it, you're already carrying weight that doesn't belong to this moment. It feels normal, responsible even, but most of what exhausts you was never required of you in the first place. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius observed that the mind turns simple things into burdens, not because life is heavy, but because we grip everything too tightly. You try to control outcomes, manage perceptions, prepare for everything, but the tighter you hold, the more unstable everything feels. And somewhere in that effort, peace quietly disappears. There's a different way to live. You still care, but not in a way that drains you. You still act, but without the constant tension beneath it. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, even slightly, something starts to shift. Not outside you, but within you. You've probably noticed how quickly your mind attaches itself to things. A small comment becomes hours of overthinking. A delay turns into a story about failure. Someone's tone starts to feel like a judgment of your worth. It happens fast, so fast you don't even see the moment it begins. 1 second, something neutral happens. The next, your mind has already built a story around it. Layered, emotional, personal. And most of the time, it isn't even real. This pattern isn't about importance, it's about conditioning. Your mind has learned to treat everything as urgent, everything as meaningful, everything as something that requires a reaction. It doesn't filter, it reacts. A passing remark feels like criticism. A small inconvenience feels like a threat. And because it feels automatic, it feels true. But when everything feels important, nothing is filtered. And when nothing is filtered, everything becomes heavy. You carry that weight into everything. Conversations, decisions, even quiet moments. It shows up as tension, as restlessness, as a constant mental noise that never really stops. And after a while, you stop questioning it. You assume this is just how life feels. But it isn't. Most of that weight isn't coming from reality. It's coming from how your mind is interacting with it, and this is where something begins to shift. The moment you start observing your thoughts instead of following them, you create space. You begin to see the difference between what happens and what your mind adds to it. That space is small, but it changes everything. Because now, not every thought feels convincing. Not every interpretation feels true. You start to notice that some thoughts don't deserve your agreement. That's where clarity begins. As Marcus Aurelius put it, you have power over your mind, not outside events. And that realization shifts your focus completely, not toward controlling life, but toward understanding your response to it. Because most moments don't need a reaction. They pass on their own, quietly and naturally. But the mind doesn't let them pass. It holds, replays, analyzes, and over time, that becomes exhausting. So the shift isn't about resisting your thoughts. It's about noticing them, catching the moment when a simple event becomes a complex story, and pausing. That pause is small, but it interrupts everything. It gives you just enough distance to choose differently. At first, that choice isn't easy. The pull of old habits is strong. The urge to analyze, to personalize, to react, it feels automatic. But with awareness, something changes. You begin to see that not everything needs your involvement. Some things can exist without becoming something bigger. Some thoughts can appear and simply pass. And as that awareness grows, the weight begins to lift. Not because life becomes easier, but because you stop making it heavier than it is. If this way of seeing things is starting to make sense to you, then stay with it. And if you want to keep building this kind of clarity, this kind of control over your own mind, then consider subscribing. Not just as a habit, but as a decision to keep removing what doesn't serve you and to keep moving toward a mind that's calmer, clearer, and harder to disturb. Now consider this more carefully, because it's easy to miss. The weight you feel throughout the day doesn't always come from what's happening around you. It often comes from how you're holding on to what's happening. There's a subtle tension in the way most people move through life. A constant tightening, a quiet effort to control outcomes, to prevent mistakes, to make sure nothing goes wrong. It feels like responsibility. It feels like awareness. But underneath that, there's strain. And over time, that strain becomes exhausting. You can see it in small moments, waiting for a response that hasn't come yet and feeling your thoughts spiral. Trying to make sure a conversation goes perfectly, replaying every word in your head. Holding on to an expectation so tightly that even a slight deviation feels like something is breaking. These moments seem different on the surface, but they share the same pattern. It's not the situation creating the pressure, it's the grip you have on it. Think of holding something delicate in your hands. The instinct is to grip it tightly, to make sure it doesn't fall. But the tighter you hold it, the more your hands shake, the more your muscles tense, the more unnatural your movements become. The very act of trying to protect it begins to make you unstable. But when you loosen your grip just enough, something shifts. Your movements become smoother. Your body relaxes. You're still holding it, but you're no longer fighting it. Life works in a similar way. Most of the tension you feel isn't coming from what you're carrying, but from how rigidly you're trying to carry it. You hold on to outcomes as if they must happen a certain way. You hold on to people as if their behavior must align with your expectations. You hold on to plans as if deviation means failure. And in doing so, you create a constant internal pressure that has nothing to do with reality itself. The Stoics understood this in a way that still feels almost counterintuitive. Epictetus expressed it simply: make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. There's a quiet strength in that idea, not passive acceptance, but a shift in where you place your effort. Instead of trying to control everything, you focus only on what is actually yours to influence, and everything else is allowed to unfold without resistance. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Letting go of that tight grip can feel like losing control. There's a sense that if you don't hold on as firmly, things might fall apart. But if you look closely at your experience, you start to notice something. Most things were never fully under your control to begin with. The outcome of a situation, the reaction of another person, the timing of events, these have always existed outside your reach. The only difference is that now you're no longer exhausting yourself trying to manage them. As that realization settles in, your relationship to situations begins to change. The same circumstances are still there, the same uncertainties, the same variables, the same unpredictability, but your internal state starts to feel different. There's less tension, less urgency, less need to force things into place. You begin to move through situations instead of pushing against them. And that shift, while subtle, has a profound effect on how everything feels. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care differently. You still show up. You still put in effort. You still act with intention. But you're no longer tying your sense of stability to outcomes that you can't guarantee. You're no longer gripping so tightly that every small change feels like a threat. Instead, there's a kind of flexibility that begins to emerge. A quiet confidence that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly. Over time, this way of approaching life starts to feel more natural. You notice that situations which once felt overwhelming now pass with less resistance. Delays don't carry the same weight. Uncertainty doesn't trigger the same level of tension. Even setbacks begin to feel different, not because they're pleasant, but because they no longer define your state of mind in the same way. There's a kind of freedom in that, not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. You begin to trust that you can handle what arises without preemptively tightening around it. You begin to see that your strength doesn't come from holding on harder, but from knowing when to loosen your grip. And as that becomes clearer, something else follows. You start to experience moments more directly, without the constant layer of tension sitting on top of them. Conversations feel lighter, decisions feel clearer, even challenges feel more manageable because you're no longer adding unnecessary pressure to them. In the end, nothing external has fundamentally changed. The same world, the same unpredictability, the same flow of events continues. But internally, something is different. The weight that once felt constant begins to lift. Not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer holding it in a way that makes it heavy. And that small shift in how you relate to things quietly changes everything. This is where things often get misunderstood, and that misunderstanding keeps people stuck longer than they need to be. The idea of caring less immediately sounds like withdrawal, like a loss of passion, like stepping away from life instead of engaging with it. It gets interpreted as coldness, as indifference, as a kind of emotional shutdown. And because of that, most people reject it before they even begin to understand what it actually means. They assume that if they loosen their grip, they'll lose their drive, their relationships, their sense of purpose. But the reality is almost the opposite. Caring less, in the way it's meant here, isn't about reducing your involvement. It's about refining it. It's about removing the unnecessary emotional weight that comes from trying to control what was never yours to control. You still show up fully. You still pursue what matters to you. You still invest your time and energy into meaningful things. But you stop tying your inner stability to outcomes that are uncertain by nature. You stop measuring your worth by how things turn out, and that shift changes the quality of everything you do. The confusion comes from equating attachment with care. People believe that the more attached they are to an outcome, the more they care about it. But attachment isn't the same as commitment. Attachment is rigid. It demands a specific result. It resists change. It creates tension because it's constantly trying to force reality into a particular shape. Commitment, on the other hand, is steady. It focuses on effort, on intention, on showing up consistently, regardless of how things unfold. And when you begin to separate those two, you start to see how much unnecessary pressure you've been carrying. You can notice this in moments where things don't go as planned. When you're deeply attached, even a small deviation can feel like a major disruption. Your mood shifts, your thoughts spiral, you start questioning everything. But when you're committed without attachment, the same situation feels different. You adjust, you respond, you move forward without turning the moment into something bigger than it needs to be. The external situation hasn't changed, but your internal experience of it has. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes practical rather than abstract. Epictetus expressed it clearly. Some things are up to us and some things are not. It sounds simple, almost obvious, but living it requires a level of awareness that most people don't develop. Because in daily life, that line gets blurred constantly. You start treating other people's opinions as if they're within your control. You treat timing, outcomes, and external circumstances as if your effort alone should determine them. And when reality doesn't align with that belief, frustration follows. The shift begins when you start to draw that line more clearly. You recognize what actually belongs to you, your actions, your decisions, your responses, and you begin to release what doesn't, other people's reactions, unpredictable outcomes, the countless variables that exist outside your influence. This doesn't mean you stop caring about those things entirely. It means you stop letting them dictate your internal state. You engage where you can, and you let go where you can't. At first, this can feel like a loss of control, but over time, it reveals itself as a different kind of control. Not control over events, but control over yourself. And that form of control is far more stable, because it doesn't depend on things going a certain way. It doesn't collapse when something unexpected happens. It remains steady even when circumstances shift. As this becomes more natural, your energy starts to concentrate. Instead of being spread thin across everything, It becomes focused on what actually matters. You put more effort into your work, not because you're anxious about the result, but because you're fully present in the process. You invest in relationships, not because you're trying to secure a certain response, but because you value the connection itself. And in doing so, the quality of your actions improves. There's also a quiet confidence that begins to develop, not the kind that comes from guaranteed success, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever happens, because you're no longer tying your sense of stability to things you can't control. You're no longer building your peace on something unstable. Instead, you're grounding it in something consistent, your own ability to respond with clarity. This way of moving through life doesn't remove challenges. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it changes how those things affect you. They stop feeling like threats to your identity or your sense of worth. They become situations to navigate rather than problems to resist. And that shift reduces a significant amount of unnecessary stress. Over time, you begin to see that caring less, in this sense, isn't a loss at all. It's a refinement. You're not reducing your engagement with life. You're removing the parts of that engagement that were draining you. You're keeping what matters and letting go of what doesn't. And as that balance becomes clearer, you start to experience a kind of steadiness that doesn't depend on everything going right. That steadiness becomes the foundation for everything else. It allows you to act without hesitation, to care without fear, to move forward without constantly looking over your shoulder. And in that space, you begin to understand something that isn't immediately obvious at the start. The less you care about what you can't control, the more effectively you can care about what you can. What makes this so difficult isn't a lack of understanding. On some level, you already know that holding on to everything isn't helping you. You've felt the tension. You've seen how your thoughts can spiral beyond what the situation actually requires. And yet, even with that awareness, the pattern keeps repeating. The mind returns to the same loops, the same worries, the same attempts to anticipate what might go wrong. It feels automatic, almost like something you don't fully control, and in many ways, that's because it has been trained to operate this way over time. Your mind has taken on the role of a protector, but not in the way you might expect. It believes its job is to constantly scan for problems, to stay one step ahead of anything that could disrupt your sense of stability. It looks for risks, for uncertainties, for anything that might go wrong, and it tries to prepare you by running through scenarios in advance. At first glance, this seems useful. It feels like awareness. It feels like responsibility. But there's a difference between being aware of potential challenges and being consumed by them before they even exist. That distinction is where most of the unnecessary weight begins. Because the mind doesn't always stop at awareness. It moves into repetition. It takes a single possibility and replays it in different forms, adding detail, adding emotion, making it feel more real with each pass. And as it does this, your body responds as if the situation is already happening. Your heart rate shifts, your muscles tighten, your attention narrows. You're no longer simply thinking about something that could happen. You're experiencing it as if it already has. And this is where the problem becomes clear. If worrying truly improved outcomes, if it genuinely prepared you in a meaningful way, then the cost might be justified. But when you look closely at your own experience, you start to see a different pattern. Most of what you worry about never unfolds in the way you imagined. The scenarios your mind constructs rarely match reality. And even when challenges do arise, they often come in forms you didn't anticipate at all. So what then is the function of all that mental effort? It doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It doesn't guarantee better results. What it does, more often than not, is drain your energy in advance. It takes moments that could have been calm, neutral, or even enjoyable, and fills them with tension. It pulls you out of the present and places you in a version of the future that doesn't exist yet. And in doing so, It makes life feel heavier than it actually is. There's a line from Seneca that captures this precisely. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. It's a simple observation, but it points directly to what's happening beneath the surface. The mind, in its attempt to protect you, ends up creating a form of suffering that is entirely self-generated, not because it intends to harm you, but because it hasn't learned to distinguish between useful preparation and unnecessary repetition. This doesn't mean the mind is an enemy. It means it's a tool that has developed habits. And like any habit, it continues unless it's brought into awareness. The goal isn't to stop thinking about the future entirely. Planning, reflecting, considering possibilities, these are all useful when done intentionally. The issue arises when those processes become automatic, when they run without direction, when they continue long after they've served any practical purpose. You can begin to notice this in your own experience. There's a point where thinking shifts from being helpful to being repetitive, a point where you're no longer gaining insight, but simply circling the same thoughts again and again. And when you reach that point, continuing to engage with those thoughts doesn't bring clarity. It brings fatigue. It creates a sense of urgency without resolution. This is where a subtle shift can begin. Instead of trying to force your thoughts to stop, you start to recognize when they've stopped being useful. You see the pattern as it unfolds. You notice when your mind is replaying something that doesn't need to be replayed. And in that moment, you have the option to step back, not by resisting the thought, but by not feeding it further. At first, this feels unnatural. The impulse to continue thinking, to keep analyzing, to search for some kind of certainty can be strong. But as you practice stepping away from that impulse, even briefly, you start to experience something different. A moment of quiet, a small release of tension, and over time, those moments begin to expand. As they do, your relationship with your thoughts changes. You begin to see them not as commands that must be followed, but as signals that can be observed. Some of them are useful, worth engaging with. Others are simply noise, repeating out of habit. And the more clearly you can see the difference, the less power those unnecessary thoughts have over you. This doesn't eliminate uncertainty from your life. It doesn't remove challenges or unpredictability, but it changes how those things affect you. Instead of experiencing them twice, once in imagination and once in reality, you begin to meet them only when they actually arrive, and that alone reduces a significant amount of unnecessary strain. In that space, something important becomes clear. Your mind doesn't need to solve everything in advance for you to be capable of handling what comes. It doesn't need to anticipate every possible outcome for you to respond effectively. In fact, the more you allow things to unfold without constant interference, the more present and adaptable you become. And that presence is where real clarity exists. Not in endless anticipation, not in constant mental rehearsal, but in the ability to meet each moment as it is, without adding layers that don't belong. The mind may continue to suggest that worry is necessary, that it's helping, that it's keeping you safe. But with awareness, you begin to see through that illusion. And once you do, the need to carry that constant mental burden starts to fade. And this is where something subtle begins to shift, almost quietly at first, but with a depth that becomes impossible to ignore once you notice it. The moment you stop automatically agreeing with every thought that enters your mind, something changes in your relationship with yourself. Instead of being pulled instantly into reactions, into emotions, into interpretations, you begin to see them as they are. Movements within the mind, not commands that must be followed. That alone creates space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. It doesn't happen in a dramatic way. There's no sudden transformation, no instant clarity that solves everything at once. It starts small. A moment where a thought appears, and instead of immediately believing it, you hesitate. You don't push it away, but you also don't lean into it. You simply notice it. And that act of noticing, simple as it seems, interrupts a pattern that may have been running for years without question. That interruption is where distance begins to form. Not distance from your life, not from your responsibilities or your experiences, but from the automatic suffering that comes from reacting without awareness. Because most of what exhausts you isn't what happens, it's how quickly and intensely you respond to it. It's the way your mind takes something neutral and turns it into something personal, something urgent, something that demands your full attention. When you begin to question that process, even slightly, the intensity starts to soften. A situation arises, and instead of being immediately swept into it, you pause. It might only last a second, maybe less, but within that pause, there is a kind of clarity that wasn't there before. You observe what's happening, both externally and internally. You notice the thought forming, the emotion building, the impulse to react. And instead of moving with it automatically, you allow yourself to choose. That choice is often quieter than expected. It doesn't feel like a grand decision. It feels like restraint, like stepping back just enough to see things more clearly. And in that moment, you begin to realize that not every reaction is necessary. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every emotion needs to be expressed immediately. Some can be allowed to pass without turning into something larger. This is where a deeper kind of freedom begins to emerge. Not freedom from life's challenges, but freedom from being controlled by your immediate responses to them. Because when every thought leads to a reaction, and every reaction leads to more thoughts, you're caught in a cycle that never really gives you space to breathe. But when you introduce even a small pause into that cycle, the entire dynamic begins to shift. There's a line from Carl Jung that reflects this perfectly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That idea points directly to what's happening here. When you're unaware of your patterns, they feel inevitable. Your reactions feel automatic, your thoughts feel authoritative, and your emotional responses feel justified without question. But the moment you start observing them, they lose some of that power. You begin to see that what once felt like reality is often just interpretation. What once felt like certainty is often just repetition. And what once felt like something you had no control over is actually something you can step back from, even if only slightly at first. That awareness doesn't eliminate thoughts or emotions, but it changes your position in relation to them. As this awareness grows, you start to notice patterns that were invisible before, the same types of thoughts appearing in different situations, the same emotional responses triggered by familiar cues, the same narratives repeating themselves, even when the context changes. And once you see those patterns clearly, they begin to lose their hold over you. This doesn't mean you become detached from everything. It means you become less entangled in what doesn't serve you. You still experience emotions, but they don't pull you as far. You still have thoughts, but they don't define your actions as quickly. There's a kind of steadiness that begins to develop, not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer reacting to everything in the same way. That steadiness grows over time. The pauses become more natural. The awareness becomes more consistent, and the space between thought and reaction becomes something you can rely on, rather than something that appears occasionally. In that space, you begin to respond instead of react. And that distinction, while subtle, changes the entire quality of your experience. You start to feel less rushed internally, less pressured to respond immediately, less driven by impulses that once felt urgent. There's a sense of control that isn't based on forcing anything, but on understanding what's happening as it unfolds. And with that understanding comes a kind of calm that isn't dependent on external conditions. As this continues, the weight you once carried begins to shift. Not because situations have changed, but because you're no longer adding layers of unnecessary reaction to them. You're allowing things to be what they are without immediately turning them into something more. And in doing so, you create space not just in your thoughts, but in your entire experience. That space becomes the foundation for everything that follows. It allows you to engage with life more directly, without the constant interference of unchecked reactions. It gives you the ability to move through situations with clarity rather than confusion. And most importantly, it shows you that freedom isn't something you find outside of yourself. It begins in that small, often unnoticed moment where you choose not to react automatically and instead simply observe. There's a quiet habit most people carry without realizing it, and it shapes far more of their emotional life than they think. It's the tendency to take things personally, even when those things were never truly about them in the first place. A shift in someone's tone feels like rejection. A delayed response feels like disinterest. A critical remark feels like a direct attack on your worth. And before you even have time to question it, the feeling settles in as if it were fact. It feels real. It feels justified. But often, it's not accurate. The mind fills in gaps quickly. It doesn't like uncertainty, so when something is unclear, it creates a story. That story usually places you at the center, assigning meaning to someone else's behavior based on your own fears, your own past experiences, your own internal patterns. And because that story feels immediate, it rarely gets questioned. You move forward as if it were true, carrying the emotional weight that comes with it. But when you slow things down, even slightly, something becomes more visible. People act based on their own internal state, not yours. Their stress, their distractions, their insecurities, their habits, these are the forces shaping their behavior far more than anything related to you. A sharp tone might come from their own frustration. A lack of response might come from their own preoccupation. A critical comment might reflect their own perspective, not your actual value. And yet, without awareness, you absorb it all. You take in the tone, the silence, the words, and you turn them into something personal. You carry emotions that were never meant for you. You hold on to tension that originated somewhere else. And over time, that accumulation becomes heavy. Not because life is constantly attacking you, but because you're taking in more than you need to. This is where a shift begins to matter. Not a dramatic shift, not a complete detachment from others, but a simple step back. A moment where instead of immediately internalizing what happens, you pause and look at it more objectively. You ask yourself whether this situation truly belongs to you, or whether you've simply taken it on out of habit. And often, the answer is clearer than expected. There's a reflection from Marcus Aurelius that aligns closely with this idea. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. That realization doesn't dismiss your feelings, but it redirects your attention. It shows you that the intensity of your reaction is often shaped more by your interpretation than by the event itself. As you begin to see this more clearly, your relationship with other people starts to change. You stop assuming that everything is about you. You stop interpreting every action as a reflection of your worth. And in doing so, you create space between what happens and how you feel about it. That space allows you to respond more calmly, more accurately, without immediately turning the situation into something personal. This doesn't mean you ignore everything. It doesn't mean you become indifferent to how others treat you. It means you become more selective. You start to recognize what deserves your attention and what doesn't. Genuine issues, meaningful conversations, situations that require action, these still matter. But the small, automatic reactions that once pulled you in begin to lose their hold. Over time, this selectivity becomes a form of protection, not a rigid barrier, but a quiet filter. You're no longer open to absorbing everything that passes by. You allow some things in, and you let others move past without attaching to them, and that alone reduces a significant amount of unnecessary emotional strain. There's also a deeper clarity that emerges from this shift. You begin to see people more accurately, not through the lens of your own insecurities, but through a broader understanding of their own experiences, their actions become less about you and more about them, and that understanding brings a kind of calm that wasn't there before. As that calm grows, your energy starts to stabilize. You're no longer reacting to every small change in someone's behavior. You're no longer adjusting your internal state based on external signals that may have nothing to do with you. Instead, you remain more consistent, more grounded, regardless of what's happening around you. This consistency changes how you move through relationships as well. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, more present. You're able to engage without constantly defending yourself against perceived threats that may not exist. And in doing so, your interactions become clearer, more genuine, less driven by hidden tension. At the same time, you begin to feel lighter. Not because people have changed, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours. The emotional load you once picked up automatically starts to decrease. You realize that you don't need to process every tone, every expression, every word as if it were directed at your core. And as that realization settles in, something important becomes clear. Not everything deserves your reaction. Not everything deserves your energy. Some things can simply pass without being turned into something more. And when you allow that to happen, you create space not just in your mind, but in your entire experience. That space is where a different kind of freedom begins to take shape. A freedom that doesn't depend on how others behave, but on how you choose to interpret and respond. And once you begin to live from that place, even in small moments, the weight you once carried starts to fade in a way that feels both subtle and deeply relieving. At first, this shift doesn't feel comfortable. It feels unfamiliar, almost like you're stepping away from something that once gave you a sense of control. There's a part of you that resists loosening that grip because it has been there for so long that it feels necessary, holding on tightly to outcomes, to expectations, to how things should unfold. It gives the illusion of stability. It feels like you're actively shaping your life, like you're staying ahead of uncertainty. But when you begin to let go, even slightly, there's a moment where that illusion fades, and it can feel unsettling. That discomfort is natural. It's what happens when a deeply ingrained habit starts to loosen. For a long time, control has been your way of navigating the world. It has been your method of reducing uncertainty, of trying to make things predictable, of creating a sense of order in situations that are inherently unpredictable. So when you stop tightening around everything, it can feel like you're exposing yourself to chaos, like you're leaving things up to chance in a way that feels risky. But if you stay with it, something begins to change. The initial discomfort doesn't last. It starts to give way to a different kind of experience, one that feels lighter, more open, less constrained. Situations that once triggered immediate tension begin to feel less intense, not because they've changed, but because your relationship to them has. You're no longer bracing yourself in the same way. You're no longer trying to force everything into a specific outcome. There's a subtle easing that happens in your body as well. The constant background tension begins to soften. You notice that you're not as tight, not as reactive, not as internally pressured to manage everything at once. Moments that would have previously felt overwhelming begin to pass with less resistance. They still happen, but they don't linger in the same way. They move through your experience instead of getting stuck in it. And this is where the shift becomes more noticeable. You begin to realize that the need for everything to go your way was never actually helping you as much as you thought. In fact, it was creating a kind of friction that made everything feel harder than it needed to be. The more you tried to control outcomes, the more tension you created when things didn't align with your expectations. And since things rarely unfold exactly as planned, that tension was almost constant. There's a reflection from Seneca that captures this idea in a simple way. A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. That suffering often comes from resisting what is already happening or trying to prevent what hasn't happened yet. And when you begin to let go of that resistance, even slightly, the unnecessary layer of struggle begins to fade. What replaces it isn't passivity. It's a different kind of engagement. You still act, you still make decisions, you still move toward what matters to you, but you're no longer doing it with the same underlying tension. You're no longer tying your sense of stability to whether things go exactly as planned. Instead, you begin to trust your ability to respond, rather than trying to control every possible outcome in advance. This trust builds gradually. It doesn't appear all at once. It develops through experience, through noticing that when you stop forcing things, you don't fall apart. You adapt, you adjust, you move forward in ways that feel more natural, less strained. And as that becomes clearer, the need to hold on so tightly begins to weaken. There's also an interesting shift in how situations unfold around you when you're no longer resisting every deviation, when you're not constantly trying to force outcomes. Things often begin to move more smoothly. Not because you've gained more control, but because you've removed the friction that was interfering with the natural flow of events. You're no longer pushing against what is, and in that absence of resistance, there's more room for things to settle into place. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Challenges still arise. Uncertainty still exists. But your experience of those things changes. They don't feel like disruptions to a plan that must be preserved at all costs. They feel like part of the process, something to move through rather than something to fight against. As this becomes more familiar, the initial discomfort of letting go fades into something else entirely. A sense of ease, not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer demanding that it be. A sense of clarity, because your mind isn't constantly trying to control what can't be controlled, and a sense of stability that comes not from external conditions, but from your ability to remain steady regardless of them. Over time, this way of approaching life begins to feel more natural than the old way. The constant tension, the need to control everything, the pressure to make things go exactly as planned, it starts to feel unnecessary, even exhausting in hindsight. And in its place, there's a quieter, more sustainable way of moving through the world. You begin to see that stability doesn't come from controlling everything around you. It comes from how you relate to it. And when that relationship shifts from resistance to acceptance, from tension to ease, from control to clarity, the entire experience of life begins to change. What once felt heavy begins to feel manageable. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel navigable, and what once required constant effort begins to unfold with a kind of natural rhythm. Not because life has changed, but because you have. So this begins to take a clearer shape in your life, not as an abstract idea, but as something practical, something you can actually feel in the way you move, think, and respond. Caring less in a healthy way doesn't mean stepping back from everything or becoming distant. It means stepping into things fully, but without tying your sense of peace to how they turn out. It means being present in what you're doing, without constantly measuring it, without needing it to validate you, without turning every outcome into a reflection of your worth. You start to notice it in your work. You still give effort, you still aim to do things well, but there's less pressure behind it. You're no longer carrying the weight of needing everything to succeed in a specific way. You focus on what you can actually influence, your attention, your discipline, your consistency, and you allow the results to unfold without attaching your identity to them. And because of that, your work often improves, not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer distracted by the constant need for a certain outcome. It shows up in relationships as well. You care about people, you listen, you give your time and energy, but you're no longer trying to control how they feel about you or how they respond. You stop trying to secure approval or avoid every possible misunderstanding. Instead, you allow connections to exist as they are, without forcing them into a shape that makes you feel safe. And in that space, something more genuine begins to emerge. You're no longer interacting from a place of fear or control, but from a place of clarity. There's also a shift in how you experience everyday moments. You begin to notice things without immediately evaluating them. A conversation doesn't need to be perfect. A moment doesn't need to be optimized. An experience doesn't need to be turned into something more than it is. You allow things to happen without constantly asking whether they meet your expectations, and because of that, you're able to be more present, more grounded in what's actually happening rather than in what you think should be happening. This way of living doesn't remove effort. It refines it. You still take action where it matters. You still move toward what's important to you, but you're no longer carrying the additional burden of trying to control everything around that action. You're no longer resisting outcomes that don't align with your expectations, and because of that, your energy becomes more focused, less scattered across things you were never in charge of to begin with. There's a line from Marcus Aurelius that captures this in a simple but direct way. Do what you will. Even if you tear yourself apart, most people will continue doing the same things. It points to something most people eventually realize. You cannot control how others act, how they think, or how they respond. And once you accept that fully, you stop exhausting yourself trying to manage it. As that acceptance settles in, your attention naturally returns to what is actually yours, your actions, your decisions, your mindset. And when you focus there, your sense of stability becomes less dependent on external factors. You're no longer constantly adjusting yourself based on what's happening around you. Instead, you remain more consistent, more grounded, regardless of the situation. This creates a kind of quiet strength, not something loud or visible, but something you feel internally. You're able to move through situations without being pulled in every direction. You're able to care without becoming overwhelmed. You're able to engage without losing yourself in the process. And that balance changes how everything feels. Over time, this becomes less of something you practice and more of something you live. It starts to feel natural to let things pass without attaching to them. It becomes easier to focus on what matters without being distracted by what doesn't. And the constant background tension that once felt normal begins to fade. You also begin to recognize how much you were carrying before. Not just responsibilities or challenges, but unnecessary thoughts, expectations, and emotional reactions that added weight without adding value. And as that becomes clearer, it becomes harder to return to the old way of holding on to everything. There's a sense of relief in that realization, not because life becomes simple, but because you stop complicating it. You stop turning every situation into something that needs to be controlled, analyzed, or fixed immediately. You allow things to unfold, and you respond when it's necessary, rather than reacting to everything automatically. And in that space, something important becomes clear. You were never meant to carry everything. You were never meant to manage every outcome, to absorb every emotion, to control every detail. That expectation was something you learned, something you adopted over time, and now you have the ability to let it go. That doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care in a way that doesn't drain you. You engage with life in a way that supports you rather than exhausting you. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes something you naturally return to. Because when you remove what isn't necessary, what remains becomes clearer. Your actions become more intentional. Your thoughts become less cluttered. Your experience becomes lighter, not because there's less happening, but because you're no longer carrying what was never yours in the first place. There's a quiet strength that begins to form when you stop reacting to everything. It doesn't make you distant, it makes you steady. You start to move through situations with more clarity, less urgency, and far less noise in your mind. Things that once pulled you in no longer have the same grip. You begin to realize that peace isn't something you find outside, but something you protect within. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes, not a technique, but but a way of being that stays with you in every moment. At the end of it all, nothing outside of you needed to change. The noise, the pressure, the uncertainty, it was always going to be there. The real shift happened within you, in how you choose to respond, in what you choose to carry, and in what you finally decide to let go of. That's where your peace lives. If something in this stayed with you, don't let it fade here. There's another video on your screen right now that will help you go even deeper into this way of thinking. Take that next step while it's still fresh in your mind.